Hello, everyone. This is Dylan Lawrence Moore with the Volitional Science Network. I've got Nima Mahjour of economicsjunkie.com with me here again today. And we decided to get together to expose what's been called the federal transition job by modern monetary theorists. And before we get into that, we thought it would be a good idea to go over the basics of why it's such a catastrophe when the government tries to create jobs. Now, most of us understand that the public sector, I mean, just from watching it, I mean, look at guys building county roads, or everybody watching the guys building the county roads, that the public sector is usually way worse at building things than the private sector is. And that often has to do with poor incentives. So in order for the public sector to spend, it has to tax from the private sector first. And when they get those taxes, of course, normally they just squander half the money away. Political favors and bureaucracy and whatever else. And by the time that the people who actually do the job get the money, they're overpaid because politicians, succumb to union demands and give them prevailing wages and healthcare benefits and retirement benefits and all this and the other thing. But by the time they actually get the money to do the job, because it's done by decree and not market forces, they do a horrible job at it anyway. So what am I missing here, Nima? Like, why would it be a good idea to have the government be creating jobs?
Well, so everything you said applies if we assume that there's a market where people are exchanging freely at first without any interference, and then the coercive government comes in and starts taking your money to fund its activities, such as, creating road jobs or building bridges and things like that, if I understood your argument correctly.
Well, I think you did. And furthermore, it's not that the government can't do something, it's more that the incentives are backwards. Because when someone gets money from the government, it's not because they went out and worked hard and they convinced you to give you the money because you're going to do a good job and have other people compete with me who might do a better job. They just take the money and decree, okay, it's going to be used for that, usually to solve a problem. And the person who's getting that money to solve that problem, usually they could figure out if they actually solve the problem, well, there will be no reason for him to have that job anymore. So the incentive is actually to continue the problem. And the only solution is they need more and more money. And so so the government keeps bloating and bloating and bloating and bloating. And the only way they can get their money is to take it from the private sector. And so the private sector slowly gets pushed out. And because the government does a worse job than the private sector, at some point, everything's going to crash because all the money is getting spent and no work is getting done.
Correct. There's in bureaucracy, there are no incentives to perform. There's just incentives to tax more and spend more. And so that's sort of the problem that you were addressing in your argument.
So by that argument, the government shouldn't be making any jobs. The government should be throwing as much stuff to the private sector as it possibly can. Now, this federal transition guarantee or federal transition job, I've also heard of it as the federal job guarantee, is this idea that the government should be hiring anyone that comes and asks for it. And how could you make an argument that that's a good idea?
So let's go back to Warren Moser. Remember that there was a lecture where he sits in front of the room and he says, okay, let's say I'm going to create an economy here. And, there's like 100 students in the room. He says, okay, so I'm selling these business cards here for $50 each. Does anyone want one? No. Does anyone want to come over here and clean up in the public sector here for one of these? No. Okay, but what if I told you that there's a guy with a 9mm at the door, and he's going to need one of these to let you leave the room. Now you're all suddenly unemployed because you need this money and you don't have it, and you can't get out of this room unless you have this money. So through coercion, I've made you all unemployed. That's what happens in reality when the federal government imposes a tax. And that's how historically monetary systems have been implemented, by having a government that says, okay, every one of you now owes me one of these a week or something like that, whatever time frame and amount. And whoever doesn't have them is now unemployed and needs work. So I have to start spending these cards into my economy by, for example, letting people clean up over here, or, you know, painting something on the wall or whatever, so that they have these things so that they can get out of the room. And that's basically what happens in a economy where the government says, okay, I'm going to declare a tax of so and so many dollars per year that you owe me. And if you don't pay me the tax, then I'll come and kick in your door and throw you in jail. So
suddenly I need that tax.
Yeah,
I need that tax token.
You need the tax token, aka money, to be able to live in freedom. If I don't spend money into this economy to give you these tax tokens so that you can pay the tax, the next thing that's going to happen is that I'm going to start knocking on your door and possessing your things, which is the worst of possible outcome of all of the outcomes, is that suddenly the government starts owning more and more of the private sector's assets. And at one point, it's just all going to be owned by the government as long as the government taxes. So unemployment, according to modern money theory, is the evidence that there's not enough tax tokens in the economy to pay the tax, and thus people are spending insufficient amounts to allow for full employment within that economy.
So now, of course, anybody who's watched our previous videos knows that I was a little bit tongue-in-cheek for the introduction. However, I think it's an important point, because all my points were valid if, as you said, money is a private sector thing. If the government was coming out of nowhere and saying, hey, you have to give us this stuff so we can spend it, all that's true. But in reality, because the government is the entity, and by government, of course, I mean federal government, is the entity that creates the money. The money has to come from the government before the private sector can spend it. So if the government's going to do that, where they say, hey, you have to pay us this tax. First, we demand a tax. This is how we create money, right? First, we demand a tax as the government. Then we spend the money into existence, and then we can collect the tax. Now, per libertarian principles, if the government creates a problem, they have to provide the solution. Now, I don't want to get too deep into a subject of rights, but I want to really quickly go over the difference between a positive and a negative right. And this is a big discussion during the founding of this country, where a negative right, which something like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of not getting...
The right to be left alone.
The right to be left alone. Nobody has to do anything for me to have that right. In fact, somebody has to do something in order to violate that right from me. So in order for me not to have freedom of the press, someone has to come and smash my press or demand a license or something like that. Whereas a positive right, say freedom or right to healthcare, right to an education, right to, I don't know, make the internet, make up something that you want, somebody has to do something for me or else my rights have been violated. And so the founders said positive rights don't make any sense, because in order for positive rights to make sense, we all have to oppress each other all the time. However, The Fourth Amendment is pretty interesting because the Fourth Amendment says you have a right to a speedy trial. The right to the speedy trial says the government's got to do something for me in order for that right to exist. So it kind of sounds like a positive right. But the difference is the government has caused the problem to begin with. The problem being they're going to come arrest you if you break the law. So if they've provided the problem of arresting you, they have to provide the solution of you have a right to a speedy trial. We can't just keep you detained indefinitely without charges and without a process of proving whether or not you actually did it and give you the ability to go free. So in a similar fashion, and I'm guessing the founders didn't really understand money enough to understand this, if the government is going to demand a tax, they have to give you a means to acquire that tax
token.
Tax token. Thank you. And so far, so good?
Correct.
So the MMTers have said, let's have this thing called the federal transition job. Now, Nima, can you tell us a little bit what that is?
Yeah, so the federal transition job means that given that the government taxes and makes people unemployed, there's a certain pool of workers that have to be employed by the government that has created the problem. So the way it has actually been tried out, I believe, in some countries, but the way that the MMTers that I've read recommend that it be implemented is that it should be a program that's funded by the federal government, but managed by municipalities and communities. So the communities have people do some useful thing, clean up the streets, whatever, whatever's
weed whack the sides of the roads, or I don't know.
Exactly.
I don't know if you want them building anything.
And the federal government makes available the funds needed to employ the unemployed. So basically, what this does is it creates a permanent market for people who are unemployed to find work, and the wage that is paid should be below or at the minimum wage, or if there's no minimum wage, then it would basically constitute the minimum wage in any economy. The important point is that the federal job guarantee program should not compete with the private sector. So if people have had enough of their guaranteed job, they can advance and hopefully quickly advance into the private sector. And people looking to hire in the private sector, they don't have to. They won't have a hard time finding people with experience of some kind. People won't have gaps in their resume, et cetera, et cetera. So this way, you'll have an ongoing smooth transition between the job guaranteed jobs and private sector jobs. And another important thing about the job guaranteed jobs is that they would be like regular jobs in the sense that you have to show up, you have to perform, you can get fired, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not like, some magical offering that
or welfare check.
Right. No, exactly. And the problem we have right now, we have I don't know how many millions on welfare. The federal job guarantee proponents say, well, why not put those people to work instead of giving them money for nothing?
Okay, so you just assailed us with points at light speed. Let's unpack a few of those. So the first one, I think this is worth reiterating. You mentioned that a local government would have the ability to hire people and use federal spending. So we got to remember that even if the federal government has this unlimited spending power, local governments don't. States, counties, municipalities, they all need to tax in order to spend. And I would say all the problems that I mentioned at the beginning of the show all apply to these more local governments, but that's another conversation for another time. What the federal transition job does is it allows the local government to connect into this infinite spending power. So it's not something that's required to pay with taxes. Am I right there?
Correct. the federal government doesn't need to raise money to be able to spend money, because they spend the money first and then they collect it.
And part of the federal transition job, and I think that word transition is very important there, is there's an issue of unemployment. And Warren Mosler goes over this beautifully, is that the private sector does not like to hire unemployed people. And I think it's intuitively obvious if you're reading somebody's resume to hire them for a job and it says they don't have a job right now, your immediate gut reaction is, there must be some really bad reason why you don't have a job right now. I'll hire the other guy who does. So, and that gets worse longer and longer as the person stays unemployed. So, I mean, think about that same issue, and you're looking at one resume where the guy hasn't had a job for a month, and you're looking at another resume where the guy hasn't had a job for 3 years. You're probably going to like hit the eject button on the guy who hasn't had a job in 3 years. So what it does is it helps in terms of unemployment. Not only does it give people a job, but it's not intended to be a full-time permanent job. It's intended to get someone on their feet, have them get something on their resume so they can go to a private sector employer and say, hey, look, I'd like to transition up to the private sector. Here's the job I had in the past.
I think you've summarized it very well. I mean, you have people who you won't have the problem of having a giant cadre of unemployed who don't have experience, who are unmotivated, who are demoralized, who start all sorts of problems. If you think about how many problems are caused by unemployment, it's a crime, drug abuse, incarceration, depression.
Yeah, and just a large part of the population that eats while everybody else works.
Right.
You also mentioned, and I think this needs to be extrapolated. Can we go over making sure that this doesn't compete with the private sector? Because I know a lot of libertarian-minded or conservative-minded, and I mean this was my first reaction as well, is if you start making all these jobs, you're going to put the private sector out of business, because that's what government normally does. It's vital to make sure that whatever the going rate is, it's lower than whatever the private sector going rate is. And because we have minimum wages, the minimum wage is the lowest thing.
Right. If we have minimum wages, then you can just offer the federal transition job just below the minimum wage or at the minimum wage. I guess would technically work as well. If you don't have a minimum wage, then the federal job guarantee just effectively becomes the minimum wage.
Correct.
For the private sector to hire you out of that, they have to pay a competitive rate.
And you also mentioned that even though we're using the federal money creation power, the local communities would have the ability to decide what was done with it. So part of the problem of government is layers of bureaucracy. The farther away that the government gets from you, the more oppressive it becomes, because you don't really have any direct way of affecting it. If the money creation power comes back to the local government, and I'm not saying that this is the most amazing idea ever, or I'm not saying this is the most utopian way of doing things, or it doesn't alleviate the problem of bureaucracy, but it gets you closer to it. And if you're closer to it, you have more control over it. And so the local communities can start deciding.
Sorry to interrupt. It doesn't necessarily even have to be local government. It could be, maybe it could even be private sector entities like foundations.
I didn't even think about that.
Etc.
Where the foundation gets permission from the federal government to say, hey, you're allowed to hire people under these parameters, exactly. And you can create money in order to do it. That's interesting. Well, and then so that even belabors the point even more, making it even more local, where people who live in the area, people who live in town, who know what the problems are directly because they're experiencing them every day, can say, hey, let's solve that problem.
Exactly.
And not worry about what it's going to cost to pay for it. What I find really interesting about this, because my first reaction was rejection, because it just sounds like a bad idea. Federally guaranteed job sounds like a horrible idea. But
Ayn Rand is strangling you from the grave.
Yeah, right. Just like, what are you talking about? I empathize, Ayn Rand. I empathize, but you screwed up on money. So when I thought about it some more, I realized that not only does this give more control to and more power to more local areas, what it does is it helps alleviate economic strain in local areas. What I mean by that is we all need a certain amount of money to work. As you and I have talked about before, there needs to be enough money, first, for everyone to be employed, second, for industrial capacity to be fully utilized, third, for everybody to pay their taxes, and four, for everybody to to save and invest at the level that they want to save and invest at. If there's not enough money to do that, the economy is essentially starved for money. So it's pretty common, and I'll say, living in the outskirts of Seattle, I could see this every day, where if you really want to make any money, generally speaking, you're driving to Seattle, even if it takes you 2 or 3 hours to get there every day. So what this could do is, if, let's say you have in the city I live in, is a small city where everybody's working in Seattle, and if we got an unemployed population, we put the federal transition job in my local city, people start to work there. Now, because that's creating money instead of costing it, they're going to spend that money into the local economy. So it's going to increase the amount of money in the local economy. Hopefully, it'll start to hit that point that I talked about before. And as the money in the local economy increases and the local business owners start getting more business, they could say, hey, we're making enough money, we can start hiring people, and then we could pay more than the federal transition job. And so people move out from the federal transition job over to the private sector, and that slows down the money creation. And theoretically speaking, it would slow it down in proportion to when it needs to be slowed down.
Right. Exactly. I mean, we've discussed before that the lack of net private saving in any economy is essentially the cause for unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. And the question came up, well, what's the correct amount of government spending then, right? How do we know what the correct amount of net private saving to inject is? And the job guarantee answers this question. The answer to the question is however much is needed to not have unemployment.
Well, and it's kind of, I know this sounds like an absolute contradiction. It's kind of a free market solution to the problem, because it's the free market that's dictating when to pull those people out of the federal job. Right. Whereas right now, when you get a job for the government, people essentially get stuck. Excuse me, they don't get stuck. You can't pull them out because the benefits are so good and they have to work so little, generally speaking.
Right. I mean, the federal, from what I've seen from the calculations, the federal job guarantee could be funded with something like 1% of GDP in the US, if I understand correctly. So you could eliminate a whole array of government programs and welfare payments, etc., for a 1 to 2% of GDP annual program that gives local communities the ability to hire and employ people, create money, which is needed because the government has imposed a tax, and then through doing that, solve all sorts of societal problems that we constantly talk about. Like I said, depression, unemployment, drugs, unmotivated individuals, demoralized communities, underutilized resources, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that's worth hammering on because, as scary as it sounds to say, okay, let's have the government create jobs, how could that possibly be worse than just giving them money for nothing?
It can't. There's no reason why we shouldn't just replace existing welfare with the federal job guarantee. It's no Republican and no Democrat, no matter how mainstream they are, can argue against that, as far as I'm aware. Unless they say, well, no, but I don't want to work. I just want to get free stuff.
Which I'm sure there's a lot of that argument.
But nobody makes that argument publicly.
Yeah, no one will admit to that.
Nobody's going to make it as a matter of public policy.
Do you have anything more to say about the unemployment problem? And actually, let's talk about inflation a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And because Warren Mosler has brought this up, because people will say, aren't you worried about inflation? Now, I think my free market answer already answered that, where once the private sector has enough money to buy out these guys, they'll just buy them out, and that'll stop the money creation. But
well, in the scenario that I laid out, where I'm just I'm declaring a tax in the at university where my students are listening, and I say there's a guy with a 9mm at the door, you need this business card to get out. How can that create inflation? There's no hot potato situation where people, oh my God, I have to get rid of this money, because that's what inflation is. People don't want to have the money. They just want to buy goods and services because the money is worthless. You have no such situation as long as there's underutilized resources and unemployment in the economy.
I think that's a super duper duper important point, because again, correct me if I'm wrong, you're the economics expert here, is that according to monetarist, do I have that word right? Monetarist theory.
Monetarists?
Mm-hmm. Monetarists. If you got $10 in your economy, let's say $100, you got $100 in your economy. If you add one more dollar to that system, nothing else matters. You just inflated the money by 1%. Is that the theory?
Right. The quantity theory of money.
That's not true until the demand has been reached.
Correct. So as long as the federal government is not competing with the private sector, there's no possibility of inflation. Now, once you've employed all the unemployed and utilized all the resources, then the only way for the government to hire new people would be to hire them out of private sector jobs. And that means they would have to bid a higher wage. That could create inflation. Mm-hmm. But until then, there's no danger of inflation occurring in any way.
Go ahead.
No danger of any dangerous or significant inflation anyway.
And to give an analogy, and I think this is a beautiful analogy that I've heard, is imagine a movie theater that has 500 seats, and the owner is selling tickets. And he sells 50 tickets, and then he stops. And he says, I don't want to sell 51 tickets because I'm afraid of devaluing my tickets. Well, you can't actually devalue the tickets until you hit 500. They're all worth the same until you hit that 500 level. At which point, if you did start printing more tickets, people would, now we were in the hot potato situation, like you said, where it's like, well, just because I have this ticket, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get in.
Right. The U.S. economy is the movie theater, and the dollar is a ticket. It gives you access to the U.S. economy.
Mm-hmm. And as Warren Mosler brought up, even if inflation is a real thing. I think that's important for us to point out. It's not like inflation doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But what he pointed out is that, generally speaking, history has shown us that people prefer a little more unemployment than a little more inflation. And if a government inflates too far, they get overthrown.
They're out. Yeah.
They're out. That's like a death score for a government. So the government doesn't want super hyperinflation, or I don't even think it has to get that hyperinflation before the government really gets in trouble. They don't want significant inflation, and the people don't want significant inflation either. And both sides kind of agree, like, we'd prefer more unemployment than we'd prefer inflation. And what we're saying with the federal transition job is we can kind of have both at the same time. We can employ everyone, almost everyone, and not let inflation go out of control.
Exactly.
Because this is such a weird concept, if you haven't heard of it before, if you have any questions, feel free to contact Nima. Feel free to contact me, comments, email, whatever. And we can compile some questions and go over them. Maybe we can get Warren Mosler on again and really go over this, because it's kind of the fundamental issue. Unemployment. Because if government creates unemployment when they demand a tax, you can't do anything until you're employed. And like you said, the societal factor of the unemployed, whether depression and crime and just a group of people sitting around eating while everybody else works, is massive. Drug abuse. Solving the unemployment issue is vital to having a healthy, functioning economy.
And a happy society, I think.
That's actually probably a more prime point. The reason we want a healthy, functioning economy is so we can have a happy society.
Exactly.
All right, Nima. Well, I hope we get a bunch of questions. It'll be fun. And I will look forward to talking to you next time about modern monetary theory.
Thanks, Dylan.